It was a crisp autumn evening in Cincinnati when Senator JD Vance stepped out of his car and adjusted his coat. He had just wrapped up a town hall event where he spoke passionately about issues close to his heart: American jobs, family values, and the struggles of middle-class workers. The crowd had been enthusiastic, and now, he was looking forward to a quiet dinner at one of his favorite local restaurants. Vance had always been a man of routine. This particular steakhouse, the Blue Oak, had been a go-to spot whenever he wanted a good meal after a long day. But tonight, something felt off the moment he walked in. The usual warmth in the air was missing. The host at the front, a young woman with dyed blue hair and a nose ring, glanced at him and quickly looked away, whispering something to her colleague. Vance approached the counter with a polite nod. "Good evening. I have a reservation under Vance," he said. The woman hesitated before responding. Yeah, about that. We can't seat you." Vance raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? Yeah, she fumbled with her words, glancing nervously at a manager standing a few feet away. The manager, a man in his 40s with thick-rimmed glasses and a smug look on his face, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Vance," he said, crossing his arms, "I'm sorry, but we have the right to refuse service to anyone." A brief silence filled the air. Other diners in the restaurant were starting to notice. "Is there a reason?" Vance asked calmly, though there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. The manager shrugged. "We just don't feel comfortable serving people like you." Vance took a deep breath. He had encountered hostility before. Politics was a battlefield, but being refused service at a restaurant? That was new. He wasn't just any customer. He was an elected official, a representative of the people. He could feel the eyes of patrons watching him, some whispering amongst themselves. He could have caused a scene. He could have called out the discrimination, taken out his phone, and blasted the restaurant on social media. But instead, JD Vance did something no one expected. JD Vance took a step back, his sharp eyes scanning the restaurant. He could feel the tension in the air, the subtle smirks from some of the staff, the hushed murmurs from the diners. He wasn't the kind of man to lash out in anger, but he wasn't one to back down either. "People like me?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "You mean people who grew up in Middletown, worked their way up, and now serve in the U.S. Senate? Or do you mean conservatives?" The manager's lips tightened. "Look, sir, we just don't want any trouble. Your views don't align with our values." Vance let out a small chuckle. One that wasn't amused but rather one of realization. So that was it. It wasn't about his reservation. It wasn't about anything he had personally done. It was political. He could feel a fire brewing inside him, but instead of fighting back, he did something that made the entire restaurant go silent. "All right then," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll buy this restaurant." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The manager blinked, his confidence cracking. "Excuse me?" Vance nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. "You heard me. If this establishment is comfortable denying service to Americans based on political beliefs, then maybe it's time for a change in ownership." Some diners gasped. A few even pulled out their phones, realizing that they were witnessing something historic. The waitress at the front, who had initially refused to look him in the eye, now seemed frozen in place. The manager scoffed. "You can't just..." Vance pulled out his phone. "You're sure about that?" He glanced at the name of the restaurant's parent company. He knew how these mid-tier chains operated. Many of them had struggling franchises barely holding on. And with his connections and resources, acquiring one was far from impossible. At that moment, a man sitting in a corner booth spoke up. "I'd pitch in for that," he said. Heads turned. It was an older gentleman in his 60s, wearing a veteran's cap. His deep voice carried weight, the kind that came from years of experience. "Been coming here for years. Didn't know they started turning away good Americans." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered in shock. Then another voice spoke up. "I'd invest too," said a middle-aged woman, standing up from her seat. "This is ridiculous. A U.S. senator gets turned away just because of politics?" That's not the America I know. The restaurant was now divided. Some people glared at Vance while others stood up inspired. The staff, clearly panicking, looked to their manager for guidance. But for the first time, the man seemed uncertain. JD Vance turned to the stunned employees and flashed a small smile. Looks like you might have a new boss soon. And with that, he walked out the door, leaving the entire restaurant in stunned silence. But this was just the beginning. JD Vance walked out of the Blue Oak with a calm expression, but inside, he was already planning his next move. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He knew that political bias in businesses was a growing problem, but now that it had happened to him in such a blatant way, he had the perfect opportunity to take a stand. Within minutes, his phone started buzzing. Someone had already posted a video of the incident on social media, and it was going viral. Conservative commentators were outraged, while liberal activists cheered the restaurant's decision. But Vance wasn't interested in outrage, he wanted action. Back in his car, he made a call. Hey Mark, I need you to look into the ownership of the Blue Oak in Cincinnati. Who owns the franchise, their financials, everything. Mark, a former investment banker and now a close advisor, chuckled on the other end. You're really going for it, huh? I don't make empty promises, Vance replied. If they think they can silence people like me, they've got another thing coming. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. JD Vance denied service at restaurant, plans to buy it out. Political divide hits dining industry, senator vows to take over liberal-owned steakhouse. Freedom versus wokeness? JD Vance's steakhouse standoff heats up. Some called him a hero standing up for free speech. Others painted him as a villain trying to strong-arm a small business. But one thing was clear, this wasn't going away anytime soon. A few days later, Mark came back with the details. The Blue Oak was indeed part of a struggling restaurant chain owned by a parent company that had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy for months. A few well-placed investments and Vance could gain control of not just the Cincinnati location, but multiple outlets across the Midwest. Looks like they picked the wrong guy to mess with, Mark said, handing over the reports. Vance smirked. Let's see if they still feel the same way when they're asking me for a job. But just as he was about to move forward with his plan, something unexpected happened. The restaurant's employees started speaking out. Some staff members, feeling the pressure of national attention, began leaking information to reporters. One anonymous waitress admitted in an interview, "We were told not to serve him. The manager made it clear that if JD Vance walked in, we had to turn him away. A lot of us didn't agree, but we didn't want to lose our jobs." The revelation sent shockwaves across the country. This wasn't just an individual decision by a single restaurant. It was coordinated. But by whom? And why? JD Vance had set out to buy a restaurant. Now he was about to uncover something much bigger. JD Vance sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. What started as a simple dinner rejection had now exploded into a national controversy. The leaked employee testimonies had shifted the narrative. This wasn't just a rogue manager refusing service. There was something bigger at play. Mark walked in, tossing a folder onto the desk. "You're gonna want to see this," he said. Vance opened it and skimmed the contents. His eyes narrowed. "The Blue Oak's parent company, Benton Hospitality Group," Mark explained. "Turns out they've been making quiet donations to some pretty far-left activist organizations. And get this, their CEO, William Carter, has been openly advocating for conservative blacklists in the restaurant industry." Vance clenched his jaw. So this wasn't just a random decision. They're actively discriminating against people based on their politics. "Exactly," Mark said. "They're trying to make it impossible for conservatives to exist in certain public spaces. First, it's restaurants. Next, who knows? Hotels? Grocery stores." Vance leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He had initially planned to buy the Blue Oak as a symbolic move, but now this was about something far bigger. This was about protecting free speech, ensuring that Americans, regardless of their political beliefs, weren't ostracized from society. He picked up his phone and made a decision. It was time to go public. The next day, Vance held a press conference outside the Blue Oak. Reporters swarmed as he stepped up to the podium. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed his way. "Last week, I was refused service at this restaurant because of my political beliefs," he began. "Since then, we've uncovered disturbing evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident. The parent company of the Blue Oak has been actively blacklisting conservatives, ensuring that people like me, and people like you, aren't welcome in their establishments." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I've spent my life fighting for American values, for fairness, for freedom, and I won't stand by while businesses try to turn this country into a place where only one political viewpoint is allowed to exist." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he dropped the bombshell. "That's why, as of today, I'm launching a multi-million-dollar initiative to support restaurants, small businesses, and entrepreneurs who believe in free speech and open dialogue. No American should be denied service because of their beliefs." The crowd erupted in applause. Even some reporters, usually skeptical of him, looked impressed. It was official. Vance had turned a simple act of discrimination into a full-blown movement. But just as he stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed with a message that made his blood run cold. "You don't know who you're messing with. Back off. Last warning." Vance read it twice, then smirked. Now he knew for sure he was onto something big. JD Vance stared at the message on his phone, the anonymous threat confirming what he had already suspected. This wasn't just about a restaurant, or even one company. This was part of a larger, coordinated effort to silence people like him, people who refused to bow to a radical agenda. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "They really think they can scare me off with a text message?" But Vance knew better than to ignore threats. He forwarded the message to his security team and made another call. "Mark, we're going all in. I want a full-scale investigation into Benton Hospitality Group, who they're connected to, where their money comes from, and what other businesses they control." Mark exhaled through the phone. "You sure? This isn't just about a steakhouse anymore. You're talking about taking on some serious players." Vance's voice was steady. "I don't care if it's one restaurant or 100. If they think they can blacklist conservatives from public life, I'm going to make sure the whole country sees what they're doing." Over the next few weeks, a firestorm erupted in the media. Vance's initiative gained massive traction. Donations poured in, and thousands of small business owners across the country voiced their support, sharing their own experiences of being pressured or punished for their beliefs. At the same time, investigative reporters started digging into the Blue Oak's parent company. What they uncovered was bigger than anyone imagined. Benton Hospitality Group had deep financial ties to activist organizations that were funding cancel culture efforts across industries. They weren't just blacklisting conservatives in restaurants, they were doing it in hotels, tech companies, even medical institutions. The media frenzy hit its peak when an insider leaked internal emails revealing a shocking strategy. "We must ensure that anyone opposing our values is systematically excluded from our spaces. If they can't eat, sleep, or work without conforming, they'll eventually give in." The revelation was a turning point. Even some of Vance's critics had to admit this was dangerous territory. The American public, regardless of their politics, was outraged. If businesses could openly discriminate against people for their beliefs, what was stopping them from targeting anyone they disagreed with? Sensing the heat, Benton Hospitality Group's CEO, William Carter, held a press conference to do damage control. "We regret any misunderstanding," he said with a forced smile, trying to downplay the scandal. "Our company values inclusivity and fairness." But it was too late. The damage was done. Lawsuits were already being filed, and major investors were pulling out. Within days, Benton Hospitality Group's stock plummeted, and the company announced the closure of several locations, including the Blue Oak in Cincinnati. JD Vance didn't need to buy the restaurant anymore. He had one without spending a dime. And just to drive the point home, he hosted a public barbecue in front of the now shuttered Blue Oak, inviting everyone. Conservatives, moderates, even liberals willing to have an open conversation. Thousands showed up, celebrating not just a political victory, but a win for free speech and fairness. As Vance stood at the grill, flipping burgers, an elderly man approached him. "You did good, son," he said, tipping his veteran's cap. You reminded this country what freedom really means. Vance nodded, shaking his hand. I didn't do it alone. This was all of us. The battle for America's values was far from over, but for now, JD Vance had sent a clear message. If you try to silence the people will rise louder than ever before.